Good evening. Thanks for joining us on one of the early installments of the Spirit Way Project video program. My name is Mason Winfield. I'm the author of 14 books, mostly on the supernatural folklore and history of upstate New York. You know, one of the things about ghosts that has always fascinated me is the way they appear to come to us in different forms. Now, the average person probably, when they hear a report of a ghost, they either presume that it's untrue because there is no such thing as ghosts, or they believe it's a spirit and it's back with a message. But if you try to look at this stuff the way I do, almost like a scientist looking at a very unscientific business, what I tend to believe is when somebody says they've seen a ghost, I've been told a story. I've been told a story about a person's experience. All that said, there are a number of patterns that tend to come up in reports of ghosts. About the upstate, I've got a top 10 list of what seems to me to be the most common ghostly forms. I will start with the inveterate little girl ghost. The little girl ghost is, in my opinion, without question, the most common ghostly form to be reported about upstate New York. There are so many of them in the city of Buffalo, there has to be a brownie troop of them. I mean, and people sometimes chuckle at that, but I have to tell you, these little girl ghosts, they don't even get along all that well with each other, you know? It's like the little girl ghost of the town ballroom and the little girl ghost of the mansion on Delaware. You know, when the Backstreet Boys were in town, the two of them went to that and they didn't even tell the little girl ghost of the Holiday Inn on Grand Island. So they can be little sharks. People have asked me, why do I think this one form, the little girl ghost, why is that so likely to be reported by observers? My number one reply is, well, I'm not so sure they really all are little girl ghosts. They might be female forms. And when they appear to us, they appear quick. We're not expecting to see them. Sometimes we're scared. So what really was appearing and the way we interpret it could be two different things. But the other thing I reply often is that this is a very likely form to be lurking in our unconscious mind. I mean, we see a pale shadow, a pale form that's incomplete. It may not be very big. We think it's the little girl because that's lurking in our mind. But my last response is, you know, they've done studies of human extrasensory perception, telepathy, things like that. And they found that women have better ESP than men. I promise you that. I've lived with a couple. And children have better ESP than adults. So on the average, the most likely human being to possess psychic ability would be a little girl that might have some effect on them coming back as an apparition. My second most popular ghost is the one I often call the woman in white. The folklorists call her the White Lady. It doesn't have anything to do with clothing or ethnicity. That's just sort of a form for an adult woman ghost. They are almost as common in my experience as the little girl ghost, but the difference is they're much more likely to have a backstory. You know, the little girl ghost, they'll be telling you stories they've heard about this building. No, it's a little girl. And they almost sound like throw-ins. Whereas the White Lady, at least half the time, there's a folkloric story about her. There's a backstory. And there are a lot of those in the city of Buffalo. I think they've got a book club by now. You can see them power walking in Forest Lawn Cemetery on the right dawn. My third common form is the ghost I call the old soldier. You know, in the Northeast, we've had centuries of European occupation, wars all over the place, forts. And so the idea that the ghost of an old soldier might be appearing isn't a big surprise. The trick is, a lot of the people seeing it, making their reports to me, they're not historians. And they're not always aware of the history of their area. And they'll report an old soldier ghost to me, and they'll think they're crazy. But I might know, you're on the site of an old battlefield. You're on a military highway. Very often their reports do coincide with something verifiable. What's interesting to do, though, is ask your eyewitness. When you get a report of the old soldier, ask the eyewitness as many details as they'll give you about what it looked like. For instance, I've heard of the old soldier ghost having a flintlock, which was in use for about 400 years. And yet this one will have a tricorn hat, which is the stereotypical hat of the Revolution. Tricorn, the triangle hat, which is made by basically a top hat where you fold 3 of the flaps up. But Western New York had very little Revolutionary War activity. So if somebody says they're seeing an old soldier in a red coat and a tricorn hat, I'm beginning to think their mind could be playing tricks on them. The most convincing reports of the old soldier ghost are ones that don't look like the stereotype. The ones where somebody says it's an old farmer with a rifle. Because in most of the military activity in Western New York, a heck of a lot of the fighting was done by people who weren't wearing uniforms. My fourth most common and one of my favorite apparitions is the one I call the old chief, the form of the old Native American. There's been a lot written about why Native American ghosts are so commonly reported anyway, by white people living in particularly the Northeast. It's like we're guilty about having supplanted the Native Americans from their land, and we're not at all surprised that the ghosts of the ancestors might be back giving us a little message. Whether that be so or not, the report of the old chief, that's just my nickname for this form, is fairly common. I would say when it's most interesting to me, because anybody who's seen a Hollywood film, anybody who's seen The Lone Ranger, a Western has got the image of the Native American in their mind. But when people are living near an ancient footpath, an old fort, an ancient monument, and when they don't seem to know it, and they're reporting an apparition, it's something that they sincerely see, that's when it starts to get interesting to me. And we'll have a lot more to say about Native American spirituality quite soon. We're halfway through. My fifth favorite ghost is the little boy ghost. Because now some people might think that this is the same thing as the little girl ghost, except it's a boy. I think the little boy ghost, because he's a lot rarer than the little girl ghost, I think the little boy ghost might be much more likely to be an apparition that people are actually seeing. Not something out of their unconscious mind that they're projecting, but an apparition that's really there. And I'll say that the subject of the little boy ghost, to me, doesn't have a lot of complexity past that when the little boy is normal sized. But when the little boy is suspiciously small, that's when it starts to get really interesting. I'll have a little more on that later. My sixth favorite ghostly form is the ghost light. And I'm not talking about orbs one bit. Those orbs, those things that show up when people take pictures in an allegedly haunted site and they get these splotches. I mean, when I was a kid, we used to play around with cameras too. And we didn't say, oh man, look at that great orb I got. We said, what the heck screwed up my picture? I mean, the orb, something you cannot see with the naked eye, but it turns up on film, that's really different from what I'm talking about. I'm talking about witch lights. The Iroquois people have a name for them. They call them the Gahai. There's been a lot of study of these things. Anomalous light phenomena. Crazy lights is the technical term for ghostly lights. And the average person doesn't see a lot of these. They're very strong in the folklore of the Native Americans of upstate New York. And the witch lights, to me, are a little more interesting than an ordinary ghost because they're so often associated with places of ancient power. Places where the elders, where the ancestors would have said, oh yeah, that hill is haunted. There used to be a battle there. There's an ancient trail that only the witches used to walk. My next favorite ghost is this is our seventh. This is ghostly children, little boys and girls together, which personally I think is really different from just one little girl or one little boy. When you hear the ghostly children, it's very often at the most powerful haunted places. The Roycroft Inn, they've got ghostly children reports from the basement. Ruined castles, big battlefields. I mean, your ordinary haunted house, garden variety haunted house, doesn't tend to have ghostly children. And one of the reasons I think that the reports of the ghostly children, not always as apparitions, as visual phenomena, because that's what the word ghost means. Very often you're getting sound effects, laughter, little footsteps, even physical pranks associated with the impish nature of children. But when these children ghosts, whenever you hear them about a sight, the possibility of our next apparition form comes up. And I'm talking about one I nickname in my notes, LPA, Little People Apparitions. This is my eighth of my apparition top 10. And to me, it's possibly the most curious of them all, the Little People Apparitions. Most people in North America associate fairies, supernatural races of diminutive human beings. They associate them with the old world, with Ireland, Scotland, Wales, Germany, Scandinavia. But little people legends are all over the world. It's not only the famous ones. Unfortunately, almost only a folklorist would know that. Thus, when an outwardly appearing average American says, you'll think I'm crazy, but I saw a bunch of ghosts and they were about that big and they look like people, that gets really interesting to me. I immediately begin to examine the site where they were seen. I would point out that this little LPA, Little People Apparition, overlaps with another phenomenon that doesn't really count as a ghost, but yet a lot of children see these things. A lot of children become friends with little people that no one else can see. And when you get the rare opportunity to interview children while they're having this imaginary friend experience, because, most children, they don't have this after about 4 to 5. And very often you don't get to interview them. But when you do, or if you can talk to someone who did, ask the little kid how big their friend is. They may tell you their friend looks like an old farmer or whatever, might even be an animal. But how big is the friend? It's almost never bigger than the kid. Could be smaller. So if you got a 4-year-old, I don't know, that's a little people. My 9th apparition form is the stereotypical shadow. Now, in the advent of TV ghost hunting, most people's only exposure to supernatural subjects or supernatural phenomena is through TV. I must impress upon you all, TV is entertainment. It's not research. When you watch TV, you're not doing research. Maybe they did, but you don't know. But in the advent of TV ghost hunting, this shadow or shadow people has gotten to be on everyone's minds, shadow people. But you know something? In the old days, the shadow is a very rare apparition form. If you do interviews well, you can't do interviews from the Middle Ages, but if you do research on the forms of ancient ghosts, the shadow almost doesn't exist. It's extremely rare. So why are people reporting so many more shadows these days? Well, the answer is because they're watching a lot of, reality TV ghost hunting. And reality TV ghost hunting has trouble coming up with real evidence for you. And a shadow is a pretty accidental anomaly. There could be shadows. There are going to be shadows in this room before too long, and who knows what they are. So this shadow form, in the old tales, the shadow usually represents a human being who has some sin or something to expiate. And a lot of the shadow form stories I've heard in the old legends are associated with churches. My last apparition form is one I'm going to call the AAF, the altered animal form. And the reason I'm calling it an apparition is because what's the definition of an apparition? It's a supernatural image. People see it. Nobody can catch one. It doesn't last very long. It vanishes, and nobody knows where it goes, and it almost never leaves any material trace of itself. The altered animal form is one of the most unusual apparitions. Most people who see these things around Western New York don't even classify them as ghosts. They think they saw something bizarre and that they're crazy. And by an altered animal form, I may mean a dog that's walking on its hind legs, a dog with a human head, just crazy animal forms. And it's a rare apparition group, but most of the time when people say they see them, they're on ancient power ground. They're somewhere that the Native American elders would say, you really shouldn't be, and you're being given a sign right now that you're not supposed to be here. I'm not even sure if the elders, the power people, are projecting this image, or whether it's sort of like a psychic booby trap, where if you're the wrong person at the wrong time in the wrong place, up something flickers and you see it. But many people are absolutely terrified when they see an AAF, an altered animal form. I'm not even positive that Bigfoot might not be one of them. Thank you so much for joining me this evening on my short little talk about apparition forms. Thanks for joining us with Spirit Way Project. We'll have a lot more coming for you sometime soon.